So let's start off by thinking about how climate change may impact wildlife species. How might wildlife be sensitive to climate? Well, there's obviously physiological limitations that may limit a species' ability to adapt to a warming of the climate or a changing of the climate. Great example is the American pika. Wildlife may also occupy habitats that are particularly sensitive to climate. Here in this image you can see kind of a wetland habitat that in the absence of sufficient precipitation would simply cease to exist, and that could have implications for the wildlife that inhabit that wetland. Wildlife species differ in their ability to disperse and to track changes in climate. Here are two images of an amphibian which we would consider to be dispersal limited versus a raptor, which is able to disperse large distances at rapid rates as may be necessary with a changing climate. So dispersal ability may impact a species' ability to respond to climate. Population growth rates may be particularly sensitive. In particular, survival rates or reproduction rates may respond to changing climate and impact species. And many species are, their distributions or population abundances are dependent on another species. Perhaps they are a specialist, maybe specializing in a certain prey or a certain host, or perhaps their distribution is limited by competition with another species. So all of these interactions have the potential to change under a changing climate and have potential to impact wildlife. And then finally, many wildlife species are associated with disturbance regimes that are particularly sensitive to climate, and therefore changes in those disturbance regimes will have implications for those wildlife species. So there's a number of different ways in which climate change can impact wildlife. To date, the majority of studies that have looked at climate change impacts on wildlife have employed an approach that I'm going to describe here and refer to as bioclimatic distribution modeling. This is a modeling approach where we take downscale climate data as well as historical climate data, relate that historical data to the current distribution of a wildlife species, create that model, and then use projected climate data as an input to the model to see how that climate space may shift under a future climate. So these are correlative or empirical models that use downscaled climate data as an input. Here's an output from one such model for the Canada lynx. This is the output using historical climate data. So what we're doing here is just recreating the current distribution of the lynx based on current climate. The green areas are areas that are sort of identified as climatically suitable. And then now let's make a comparison with some projections using this bioclimatic approach. Here are two different projections based on two different GCM models run under the A2 emission scenario, and these are just end-of-century projections. And what we can see here is that these projections are suggesting that there will be a decrease in suitable climate space in the boreal region of sort of Canada, as well as in the northern Rocky Mountain region of the lower 48. So kind of an interesting result and an interesting method which provides maps of projected future climate in this kind of binary format of what might be suitable in the future under these different scenarios. How does this modeling approach, this method, do in terms of addressing the different mechanisms that we know that wildlife species may be responding to climate? Certainly is able to capture these physiological implications. So how, if a species is limited in its physiological tolerances, those are definitely likely to be captured in this bioclimatic modeling approach. It may be capturing sensitive habitats to the extent that those habitats are directly represented by those bioclimatic variables that are included in these models. It doesn't really look at a species' ability to disperse and move along with the changing climate, so that's a limitation. Nor does it really look at demographic rates or population growth rates and how those may change under a changing climate. It doesn't really consider interspecific interactions, and it may or may not consider the impacts of changing disturbance regimes to the extent that those are correlated to the bioclimatic variables. So the approach that has been most commonly used to look at how wildlife species may respond to climate change does have some limitations. And so what I want to do today is present a new approach, a more mechanistic approach that we're hoping will, or that I'm going to hopefully argue will capture some of these mechanisms and give us a little bit better sense of how wildlife species might respond to changes in climate. So this mechanistic approach is going to link a number of different modeling techniques. We're going to start with statistically downscaled global climate model outputs. And the data that I'm going to show to you was downscaled by applying anomalies to observed historical climate, the so-called delta method. And the downscaling was done to 30 arcsecond, or approximately 1 kilometer grid cell size. We downscaled output from 5 different GCM models that were produced in this CMIP3 effort. So this was begun before CMIP5 data was available. And all of the outputs that I'm going to share are from the A2 emission scenario. So took this downscaled climate data and input it into a dynamic vegetation model. The vegetation model that was used was LPJ, and this is simulating 8 different plant functional types. We're not actually simulating plant species on the landscape, but rather characterizing different plant species by these plant functional types. And this mechanistic model is capturing different processes such as carbon dioxide fertilization. It does include a fire module, and it does include competition among these different plant functional types. So again, the downscaling is done on an annual basis. We're inputting this annual projected climate data into the dynamic vegetation model and producing annual outputs of changes in vegetation over time in the next century. And these outputs are classified into different biomes. Okay, and those biomes are used to characterize suitable habitat for the different wildlife species. So I input those biome projections into a spatially explicit population model that's been calibrated for our wildlife species of interest. And in addition to the vegetation data, we're also inputting directly some key bioclimatic variables that have been identified in empirical studies to be particularly important for that wildlife species. The population modeling is done in the HEXIM modeling framework. This is an individual-based model. What that means is that we're actually simulating every individual in the population, in the wildlife population, and we're following that individual as they go through their annual life cycle. And so they are actually going through a survival, perhaps winter survival, and then reproduction, and then dispersal in each year. So we're mechanistically simulating all of these life stages and processes. So how well does this approach do in addressing all of these mechanisms that we know are important for how wildlife species respond to climate? Again, we are able to capture some of those physiological limitations. Here, because we're using the vegetation model, we are able to look at things like habitats that are particularly sensitive to changes in climate. We are explicitly modeling the dispersal ability of different wildlife species, and we are explicitly modeling population growth rates. We have the capacity with this approach to look at interspecific interactions. The examples that I'm going to share with you today do not necessarily address that, but this approach does allow you to model actual 2 different species simultaneously. And then finally, through the vegetation model, we're able to look at disturbance such as fire. So certainly an upgrade in this approach. So let me give you some examples from a couple of iconic wildlife species. The study area that I'm going to be focusing on is a very broad definition of the Pacific Northwest. The gray area that you see here is actually where all of the modeling was done. So all of the downscaling and vegetation modeling was done for this gray shaded area. And then these colored polygons are outlining some key ecoregions that I'll be using to kind of frame our conversation. And this extends from sort of the boreal forest in Canada through the northern and middle Rocky Mountain regions, and then the Columbia Plateau and eastern Cascades. So the first wildlife species I'm going to talk about is the wolverine. And this species is sparsely distributed across its distribution. It's a highly mobile species, generally considered a generalist. It feeds on a number of different prey and is kind of a scavenger in general. It occupies both forest and alpine vegetation, generally avoids humans, and it has been shown to be associated with spring snowpack, and that's important for denning. And so all of these factors have been incorporated into our population model. And so now I'm going to transition into some outputs. And there's a lot of data that I could talk about, and so I'm just going to kind of zoom in on a couple of key ecoregions to try to pull out some interesting patterns to share. And so what you're seeing here down in the left-hand corner is that same ecoregion map. And again, this data that I'm showing right now is just focused on the Canadian Rockies. And this is simply abundance data. So this is the simulated abundance. In the brown, you're seeing simulated abundance using output from historical climates, historical averages. So just kind of a stable population in that brown color there. And then each of these colored lines is a projection based on a different GCM model. Again, all of these are run under the A2 emission scenario. And so you can see that there's a slight decline in the abundance of wolverine in the Canadian Rockies. And there's a little bit of variability across the different GCMs, with one in particular showing a slightly more dramatic decline. Looking in now at a different ecoregion at more on the southern end of this species range. Here we are now in the Utah and Wyoming Rocky Mountains, or an area that's also kind of commonly referred to as the Greater Yellowstone area. Here we're seeing a little bit different pattern. Again, kind of a stable population in that historical data, but now these projections are showing some pretty dramatic reductions in the abundance of wolverine and a fair amount of variability across the different GCM models. Now I'd like to show you kind of a different output. This is characterizing what I'm going to call the source-sink dynamics that occurs across the species range. And so the colors here are representing the number of births minus the number of deaths. So if there are many births relative to deaths, that population is considered a source population. It may be a growing population, or it may be a population that's reached its carrying capacity and is exporting individuals to the surrounding areas. So what we're seeing in this historical data is that there's kind of a source in this northern Cordillera ecoregion. And then the purple color is referring to sink populations. These are areas where the number of deaths outpace the number of births. And so you could see declining populations there, or you could see populations that's stable because of immigration from surrounding areas. So what we're seeing in this historical map is some stronger dynamics in this northern region, some in terms of a source and a sink down in the middle Rockies, but then some sort of weak colors or lighter colors, some weak source sink dynamics in some of the other ecoregions. So how does this change in the future? That historical box is now in the bottom left-hand corner, and the rest of these are our 5 different projections. And so what you can see in that northern Canadian Rocky region is that we have a range of outputs. This is now just the end of century, so the final 20 years of the century, of the 21st century. Some weak source dynamics or some strong sink dynamics in that Canadian Rocky area. And then focusing on that greater Yellowstone area, we can see kind of stable populations or some sink dynamics going on in that southern extent. Now I'd just like to take a minute to compare some of these output to the output from our bioclimatic approach. Here again is our source sink map, and here is our bioclimatic map where we were able to predict predictions of habitat suitability or climate space suitability in the future. If we focus in on that greater Yellowstone area, we can see that, again, we're predicting a sink at the end of the century, and I already showed you this graph, even though it's very small. The population under these 2 different GCM emission scenarios goes from about 300 individuals down to about 150. So about a halving of the abundance of wolverine in this region. How does that compare with the output from the bioclimatic approach? Well, as you can see, the bioclimatic approach is essentially saying in this GCM model that there's basically no remaining habitat in that region. And then here in this second GCM, there's just very reduced habitat. And so what we're seeing here is that there's general agreement in that the wildlife population, the wolverine population will decline, but the results from the bioclimatic model are a little bit more extreme in their predictions compared to this more mechanistic modeling approach. Okay, and now I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to kind of breeze through the same graphs, but for the Canada lynx. This model is very similar. Again, we're talking about a species that's highly mobile. In this case, this species is very specialized in its prey. It really targets snowshoe hare populations, and that results in actually a cyclic population dynamic that you'll see. And what we're simulating is a 9-year cycle in the population of boom and bust in a 9-year cycle. This also inhabits forest and alpine vegetation, generally avoids humans, but is a little bit more tolerant than the wolverine, and is also associated with winter snowpack. So here we'll focus in on the Canadian Rockies again. Here we're seeing that cyclic behavior with the end of the century. Some of the GCMs are suggesting that there will be some slight increases in the abundance of lynx. Others are saying slight decreases. Here's a different ecoregion. This is now the Aspen Parkland. This is an ecoregion that's kind of on the frontier between the boreal forest and the grasslands. And what we're seeing here, I wanted to show this because it's kind of interesting, is a real increase in the abundance of Canada lynx, and a fair amount of variability across the GCM. So that's kind of an interesting output from the model. And again, looking at our source sink maps, historically strong sources in the north and weak sources or sinks in the south. And then looking at these projections, generally sources in the north with some predictions of sink behavior in the north, and then in the south, a general trend towards a sink behavior at the end of the century. And so in conclusion, generally from these results, we saw stable to declining abundance of both of these wildlife species in the southern extreme of their ranges, generally stable populations in the north across different GCM models. Some really interesting source sink dynamics occurring, particularly along range margins. And then when I did that quick comparison with the output from the bioclimatic model, seeing some general agreement in the projected trends, but the mechanistic modeling approach having a slightly less extreme prediction for the end of the century. And in final conclusion, I just want to say these are outputs thinking about things like abundance and source sink dynamics that are going to be particularly useful for management of wildlife species, and I think represents a real advance over the bioclimatic approach. This work is part of the Pacific Northwest Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment, which has many partners, and I'd particularly like to thank Sarah Schaefer, Jesse Langdon, and Alan Brooks. Thank you very much.